Imagine a world where the United States did not exist. No American flag, no White House, no United States of America. Instead, along the Atlantic coast stood 13 British colonies. They were separated by distance, economy, religion, and culture. But by the 1760s, something was changing. Britain had spent enormous amounts of money fighting wars across the world. And now it wanted the American colonies to help pay the bill. New taxes appeared, new restrictions followed. And with every new law, colonial resentment grew. The argument was simple. How could people be taxed by a government in which they had no elected representatives? At first, most colonists were not demanding independence. They wanted their rights as British subjects. But the relationship between Britain and the colonies was breaking apart. In Boston, British soldiers stood in the streets. Colonists watched them with suspicion. Tensions became violence. And in 1770, the Boston Massacre shocked the colonies. Then came the Boston Tea Party. In December 1773, colonists boarded ships in Boston Harbor and threw British tea into the water. Britain responded with punishment. The colonies responded with resistance. And soon, representatives from across the colonies gathered in Philadelphia. The Continental Congress faced a problem no one had expected to solve. What happens when protest turns into war? The answer came in April 1775. At Lexington and Concord, British troops confronted colonial militia. Then, gunfire. The American Revolution had begun. The colonies were now fighting the most powerful empire in the Western world. But they had no national army. Few trained soldiers, limited supplies, and almost no guarantee of victory. Then the Continental Congress made a remarkable decision. They chose George Washington to command the Continental Army. Washington was not the largest man in the room. He was not the most experienced general in Europe. But he had something the new army desperately needed: leadership. Washington understood that defeating Britain would not happen in one battle. The Americans had to survive. They had to keep fighting. And most importantly, they had to keep believing that victory was possible. In 1776, that belief was almost destroyed. British forces descended on New York, thousands of soldiers. Warships filling the harbor. Professional troops facing an inexperienced army. The Americans were overwhelmed. After the Battle of Long Island, Washington's army retreated. New York City fell into British hands. Then the Continental Army was pushed across New Jersey. Soldiers deserted, supplies disappeared, enlistments were expiring, and winter was approaching. The revolution seemed close to collapse. But Washington refused to give up. He understood something critical. The Americans did not need a massive victory. They needed hope. On Christmas night, 1776, Washington made a desperate decision. His army would cross the Delaware River. The weather was brutal. The water was filled with ice. Snow and freezing wind battered the soldiers. But they crossed. Before dawn, Washington's army reached New Jersey. Their target was Trenton. Inside the town were Hessian troops serving the British. The Americans attacked on December 26th. The Hessians were caught by surprise. Within hours, the battle was over. Washington had won. Then came Princeton, another American victory. The Revolution was alive again. But survival would come at a terrible price. In 1777, British forces captured Philadelphia. The Continental Congress fled. Washington's army marched to Valley Forge. There, during one of the harshest winters of the war, thousands of soldiers suffered from hunger, disease, inadequate clothing, and shortages of supplies. But Valley Forge was more than a story of suffering. It became a place of transformation. Under the training of Friedrich Wilhelm von Steuben, the Continental soldiers learned discipline, coordinated movement, and professional military drills. The army that emerged was stronger. And then came Saratoga. In 1777, American forces defeated a major British army in New York. The victory changed everything, because Europe was watching. France had long been Britain's rival. Now France saw an opportunity. In 1778, France formally allied with the Americans. French money arrived, French soldiers arrived, and French warships entered the conflict. The American Revolution had become an international war. The fighting continued for years. Savannah, Charleston, Camden, Cowpens, Guilford Courthouse. The war moved south, and Britain discovered that conquering American territory was much easier than holding it. By 1781, Washington saw an opportunity. British General Charles Cornwallis had moved his army into Virginia. He established his position at Yorktown. Washington began planning something extraordinary. American troops would march south. French troops would join them, and a French fleet would attempt to control the Chesapeake Bay. The plan worked. Thousands of American and French soldiers surrounded Yorktown. The British were trapped. At night, soldiers dug trenches closer to the British defenses. During the day, Allied artillery bombarded the town. The walls of Yorktown began to crumble. The British position became impossible to defend. Then, in October 1781, Cornwallis surrendered. The war did not officially end that day, but Yorktown changed the political reality in Britain. The cost of continuing the war had become increasingly difficult to justify. 2 years later, peace finally came. In 1783, the Treaty of Paris recognized the independence of the United States. After years of fighting, the rebellion had won. But winning independence created another problem. How do you govern a new country? The revolution had destroyed the old political order, but the new nation was fragile. The central government was weak. The states had enormous power. The country was deeply in debt, and there was no guarantee that the experiment would survive. Then, in 1787, delegates gathered in Philadelphia. They came to debate the future of the new republic. For months, they argued. They disagreed. They compromised. And eventually, they produced a document unlike anything the new nation had created before. The Constitution. On September 17, 1787, delegates signed it. But the story still had one final chapter. In 1789, George Washington became the first president of the United States. The same man who had commanded an army against Britain was now leading the government of the country that army had helped create. In barely 2 decades, the world had changed. Colonists had become rebels. Rebels had become revolutionaries. Revolutionaries had become citizens of a new nation. But this was never simply the story of Washington. It was the story of thousands of people. Soldiers, farmers, merchants, women, enslaved and free African Americans, native peoples, loyalists, immigrants, ordinary people whose lives were transformed by an extraordinary conflict. And today, the artifacts of that era still survive. The Declaration of Independence, Washington's military possessions, revolutionary weapons, letters, maps, the Constitution. These are more than old objects. They are physical evidence of a moment when history changed direction. The Declaration announced a new political idea. But an idea alone could not create a nation. People had to fight for it. They had to sacrifice for it. They had to build alliances. And eventually, they had to build a government. That is why the American Revolution is more than the story of July 4th. It is the story of how a rebellion became a nation whose future was completely uncertain in 1776, a nation that had no guarantee of survival, a nation built through war, argument, compromise, sacrifice, and political imagination. George Washington helped lead the revolution to victory. But perhaps his greatest contribution came afterward. He helped demonstrate that military power could ultimately return to civilian government. The revolutionaries had defeated an empire. Now they had to prove they could govern themselves. And that may have been the harder challenge. From 13 British colonies, it came a rebellion. From that rebellion came a revolution. From that revolution came a declaration. From the declaration came a war. And from the war came a nation. Today, as America approaches its 250th anniversary, the artifacts of its founding era carry a powerful message. Nations are not born overnight. They are built through conflict, through sacrifice, through disagreement, through compromise. And sometimes, they begin with an impossible idea. In 1776, that idea was simple. A people could choose to govern themselves. And that idea changed the course of history. A rebellion had become a nation. America had been born.